The marble floors of the Whitmore mansion gleamed under crystal chandeliers, reflecting the opulence that seemed to seep from every corner of the sprawling estate. Margaret Whitmore adjusted her silk evening gown as she surveyed the gathering. In her grand salon, tonight's charity gala was meant to impress the city's elite, and every detail had to be perfect. Mrs. Whitmore, came the soft voice of Elena Rodriguez, the head housekeeper who had worked for the family for nearly 15 years. The catering staff has finished setting up the dining room, and the string quartet is ready to begin. Margaret barely glanced at Elena, her attention focused on arranging the auction items displayed on mahogany tables. Good. Make sure they start with something light. We don't want to overwhelm our guests before dinner. As Elena turned to leave, Margaret's eyes fell on a young girl sitting quietly in the corner. A book in her lap, the child looked to be about 12, with dark curls framing an intelligent face and large brown eyes that seemed to take in everything. Around her, Elena, Margaret called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Who is that child? Elena's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. That's my daughter, Sophia. I apologize, Mrs. Whitmore. The babysitter canceled at the last minute, and I had no choice but to bring her tonight. She'll stay out of the way, I promise. Margaret studied the girl with calculating eyes. The charity auction was dragging a bit, and she needed something to enliven the evening, something memorable that would encourage larger donations. A thought began to form in her mind, a deliciously patronizing idea that would surely charm her guests. Actually, Margaret said, a smile spreading across her carefully made-up face. Bring her here. Elena hesitated. Ma'am? The piano. Margaret gestured toward the gleaming Steinway grand piano that dominated one corner of the salon. I'm sure our guests would be delighted by a little entertainment from your daughter. Something charming and authentic for our cause tonight. Elena's jaw tightened. She understood exactly what Mrs. Whitmore was implying, a quaint performance by the help's daughter. Something to make the wealthy guests feel good about their charitable giving. But before she could object, Sophia had already approached. It's all right, Mama, Sophia said quietly, placing a gentle hand on her mother's arm. At 12, she had already learned to read the subtle dynamics of power in the Whitmore household. Oh, wonderful. Margaret clapped her hands together. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced to the room, tapping her champagne flute with a silver spoon. We have a special treat tonight. This lovely child is going to play something for us on the piano. Isn't that sweet? The guests turned with polite interest, some smiling indulgently at what they assumed would be a simple children's piece, perhaps Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star or Chopsticks. The condescension in the room was almost palpable, though disguised behind cultured smiles and encouraging nods. Sophia walked to the piano bench with quiet dignity, her small frame dwarfed by the massive instrument. She adjusted the bench height and placed her hands on the keys, taking a moment to feel their weight beneath her fingers. The room grew quiet, conversations fading as the guests prepared to give their polite attention. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. Sophia's fingers began to move, and the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor filled the room. The piece, one of the most technically demanding and emotionally complex works in the piano repertoire, flowed from her hands with a maturity and understanding that seemed impossible for someone her age. The transformation in the room was immediate. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne flutes were lowered. Margaret's satisfied smile faltered and then vanished entirely as she realized what was happening. This wasn't the simple children's song she had anticipated. This was artistry of the highest order. Sophia's interpretation was breathtaking. She navigated the piece's dramatic contrasts, the lyrical passages and thunderous climaxes, with the sensitivity of a seasoned concert pianist. Her small hands moved with impossible grace and strength, drawing sounds from the instrument that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul. As the piece progressed, the guests found themselves leaning forward, completely captivated. Mrs. Hartford, a patron of the Philharmonic, felt tears welling in her eyes. Mr. Chen, a retired music professor, stood with his mouth slightly open, hardly believing what he was witnessing. Elena watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride and breaking at the same time. She had always known her daughter was special, but seeing her perform in this context surrounded by people who had never looked at them as anything more than invisible servants was both triumphant and heartbreaking. The piece built to its magnificent climax. Sophia's entire body engaged in drawing every ounce of emotion from the instrument. Her face was serene but intense, completely absorbed in the music. For those few minutes, she wasn't the maid's daughter or an object of patronizing curiosity. She was simply a pure vessel for musical expression. As the final notes faded into silence, the room remained frozen for a long moment. Then, slowly, applause began, not the polite, measured clapping that had been expected, but genuine, thunderous appreciation. Several guests rose to their feet, their faces reflecting amazement and something that looked very much like shame. Margaret stood, rigid, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Her simple plan for charming entertainment had backfired spectacularly, revealing not the quaint amateur performance she had expected, but a level of artistry that few of her wealthy guests could ever hope to achieve. Dr. Patricia Mills, the director of the city's premier music conservatory, pushed through the crowd toward the piano. "My dear," she said to Sophia, her voice shaking with excitement. "That was extraordinary. Where do you study?" Sophia looked down at her hands, still resting on the keys. "I don't have a teacher," she said quietly. "I learn from YouTube videos and practice on the old upright piano in our apartment building's community room." The admission sent a ripple of shock through the gathered crowd. YouTube videos, an old upright piano? The implications hit them like a physical blow. This level of talent, this degree of musical understanding, had been developed without the advantages that all of their own children took for granted. Private lessons, quality instruments, professional guidance. Elena stepped forward, her chin raised with quiet pride despite the uncomfortable attention. "Sophia has been playing since she was 4, she said. "We've done our best to support her love of music." But she gestured around the room, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air with all its implications about economic reality and limited opportunities. Margaret found her voice at last. "Well," she said, her tone carefully controlled, "that was very nice, dear. You may go back to your book now." But Dr. Mills wasn't finished. "Wait," she said firmly, then turned to address Margaret directly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sure you realize what we've just witnessed. This child has extraordinary talent, the kind that appears perhaps once in a generation. She needs proper training, a quality instrument, performance opportunities." The room buzzed with murmured agreement. Several other guests approached, offering business cards, talking about scholarship programs, mentioning connections at music schools. The evening had taken a turn that no one, least of all Margaret, had anticipated. James Chen, the retired music professor, shook his head in amazement. "I've been teaching for 40 years, he said to anyone who would listen, "and I've never heard a 12-year-old play Chopin like that. The technical skill is remarkable, but it's the musical maturity that's truly astounding." As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself increasingly sidelined as her guests focused their attention on Sophia and Elena. What was supposed to be her moment of charitable condescension had become something else, entirely a revelation of talent that made their own privileged circumstances seem shallow by comparison. Later, as the guests departed, many approached Elena directly, pressing business cards into her hands, making promises about phone calls and opportunities. Dr. Mills spent 20 minutes talking with Sophia about her musical education, taking notes and making plans. "I want to arrange an audition," Dr. Mills told Elena, "full scholarship to our preparatory program, and I know several donors who would be interested in supporting her development. This is not an opportunity we can let slip away." As the mansion finally emptied, Margaret stood in her salon, looking at the piano bench where Sophia had sat just hours earlier. The evening had not gone according to plan. What was meant to be a moment of patronizing entertainment had instead become a profound lesson in assumptions, privilege, and the democratic nature of true talent. Elena found her there as she began her end-of-night cleaning duties. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly, "I want to thank you for letting Sophia play tonight." Margaret turned, her expression complex. "Elena," she began, then stopped. For perhaps the first time in years,